Judith of Flanders could have been little more than a 9th century princess used as a political pawn and nothing more. But in fact, she would defy the conventions of her time by being anointed as a queen in a society that rejected the idea, bring her home culture to England, and would even eventually break free from the control of her father to choose her own third husband. Judith of Flanders was born around 843 into the Carolingian dynasty, one of the most powerful royal families in medieval Europe. She was the daughter of King Charles the Bald, who ruled West Francia, a large kingdom that would later evolve into modern France. Her father was the grandson of Charlemagne, the legendary emperor who had united much of Western Europe under the Frankish Empire. This prestigious lineage gave Judith an elite status from birth, but it also meant her life was subject to political strategy rather than personal choice. Her mother, Ermentrude of Orleans, was a devout and politically astute queen, a deeply religious woman. Ermentrude dedicated much of her life to patronizing monasteries and churches, setting an example for Judith's own later patronage. Ermentrude's piety also reflected the increasing influence of the church in Carolingian politics, an aspect that would shape Judith's experiences later in life. Judith was likely born and raised at the royal court, moving between key Carolingian palaces such as Compiègne, Aachen and Senlis, where the Frankish kings held court. These residences were centres of political activity, cultural patronage and intellectual scholarship, exposing Judith to the highest echelons of power from an early age. Unlike many noblewomen of the early medieval period, Judith was highly educated thanks to the Carolingian emphasis on learning. The Carolingians, following in Charlemagne's footsteps, promoted literacy, scholarship, and intellectual pursuits, particularly within the monastic schools they founded. Judith's education likely included Latin literacy, allowing her to read religious texts and court documents, music and poetry common in elite Frankish courts, theological instruction preparing her for a later role as wife to one of Europe's rulers, and court etiquette and diplomacy, essential for navigating noble politics. Her education would later set her apart from many of her contemporaries, especially in Anglo-Saxon England, where queens typically did not receive formal instruction. This background made her not only a politically valuable bride, but also an active participant in court life, influencing cultural and religious matters. In the mid-9th century, relations between West Francia and Anglo-Saxon England were becoming increasingly important. The Vikings posed a major threat to both realms, launching raids on coastal settlements and disrupting trade. Charles the Bald sought to strengthen ties with Wessex, the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom, by arranging a marriage between Judith and King Ethelwulf of Wessex. For Charles, this marriage was also a power move. It allowed him to extend Frankish influence into England, while ensuring his daughter married into a kingdom that was growing in power. While Anglo-Saxon England was not as prestigious as the Carolingian Empire, Wessex was becoming a dominant force among the English kingdoms. Marrying Judith to Ethelwulf solidified relations between the two ruling houses, potentially creating a united front against Viking expansion. At around 12 years old, Judith was prepared for her future role as wife to Ethelwulf, who was in his mid-50s and already had several children older than his new wife. Her upbringing at the Frankish court, combined with her education and exposure to high-level diplomacy, still meant she was better equipped for queenship than most Anglo-Saxon noblewomen of the time. However, she had no say in her own fate. Like most medieval royal women, her marriage was arranged purely for political advantage. They were married at the palace of Vauberry-sur-Oise on the 1st of October 856, and this event was more rare as Carolingian princesses rarely married and were usually sent to convents, never mind married to foreigners. But the most shocking and unprecedented aspect of Judith's marriage was not simply that she was young or from a foreign land, it was that she was crowned and anointed as queen on her new husband's insistence. In Anglo-Saxon England, queens were not typically crowned or given formal power. Unlike in Francia, where Carolingian queens played an active role in court and governance, Anglo-Saxon noblewomen had a more subdued role, often overshadowed by male rulers and church authorities. Judith's coronation and anointing sent shockwaves through the Wessex court. By receiving the holy oil of consecration, Judith was elevated to a status equal to that of a reigning monarch, something unheard of for an Anglo-Saxon queen. This move was likely inspired by Carolingian traditions, where queens often took an active role in politics and religious patronage, and it's likely Charles insisted on his daughter's queenship as part of the marriage deal. The Wessex nobility reacted with suspicion and unease. Many viewed Judith's anointing as a dangerous precedent, fearing that it could give future queens too much power or disrupt the established order. In England, a queen consort was typically expected to be a wife, a mother, but not a crowned political figure. It is possible that Aethelwulf, by insisting on Judith's coronation, was also trying to strengthen his own position as king. At the time, his rule faced internal opposition, particularly from his own son Ethelbald, who resented his father's growing ties with the Franks. Despite the controversy, Judith assumed her role as Queen of Wessex. However, given her young age and unfamiliarity with Anglo-Saxon customs, her exact role in governance remains unclear. She may have simply served as a symbolic link between Francia and Wessex, representing the alliance between the two kingdoms. Judith was likely expected to produce an heir, although given her age, this would not have been an immediate expectation. Nevertheless, Judith's time as Queen of Wessex was remarkably short-lived, and she would have no children with her first husband. In January 1858, just over a year after their marriage, King Aethelwulf died. His passing left Judith as a 13-year-old widow, far from home and trapped in a politically volatile situation. Aethelwulf's death plunged Wessex into a succession crisis. His eldest son, Ethelbald, who had long opposed his father's rule, immediately seized the throne. But the real question was, what would happen to Judith? In typical Anglo-Saxon tradition, when a king died, his widow would either retire to a convent, effectively removing herself from political life, or remain at court but lose her status as new queens took precedence. However, Judith's unique position complicated matters. Because she had been crowned and anointed, she retained a level of authority that no previous English queen had held. This made her both a political asset and a potential threat. For Judith, as a 13-year-old girl with her life ahead of her, the prospect of being sent to a convent was deeply unappealing. As a princess, she was accustomed to a life of courtly influence and noble privilege, and regardless of the fact she might have been brought up to expect a convent at some point in her future, she was too ambitious to accept it so early. Instead of accepting her expected fate, Judith did something unheard of in English royal history. She married her stepson, Ethelbald, the new King of Wessex. This move was highly controversial and was viewed as scandalous by the church and nobility alike. While marrying a deceased husband's brother or cousin was common in medieval Europe and still considered questionable in the church, marrying a stepson was far more risque. There were several reasons why this marriage might have happened. The first and most likely was political strategy. Ethelbald may have wanted to retain the Frankish alliance by keeping Judith in Wessex. Marrying her prevented any rival from using her royal bloodline for their own claim. On top of this, Ethelbald's own personal ambition probably meant he genuinely desired Judith as a queen, recognizing her prestige and influence. But there is another factor, often less considered due to her age. As a crowned queen, Judith may have had more political leverage than previous consorts. She was no ordinary widow. She had been anointed, educated, and connected to the powerful Carolingian Empire. It's possible that she had some say in the marriage, or at least could see the political advantages for herself if she agreed to it. This theory is bolstered by the fact that during Ethelbald's short reign, Judith's name appeared on several charters as Regina, confirming her high status. Whatever the motivation, the marriage caused deep unrest. It was condemned by the church, with some chroniclers labelling it incestuous, despite no direct blood relation. However, there was little that could be done. Ethelbald was king, and Judith was once again Queen of Wessex. But the marriage between Judith and Ethelbald lasted only 2.5 years. On the 20th of December 860, Ethelbald died, leaving Judith widowed once again at around 16 or 17 years old. This time, however, she was unable to stay in England. Seizing her chance, Judith sold her property, fled Wessex, and returned to Francia, likely seeking refuge with her father. Given the scandal of her second marriage, her return must have been a delicate affair, but she was still valuable politically. Upon returning to the Frankish court, possibly under an escort sent by her father, Judith found Charles to be furious over the series of events that had unfolded in England. In response, Charles had Judith placed in the monastery at Senlis, a common fate for royal widows at the time. The intent was clear. Firstly, to remove her from public political life and prevent her from becoming a tool for any rival faction. Secondly, to atone for the scandal of her past marriages. And finally, to control her future marriage prospects, preventing her from making another politically disadvantageous match. At Senlis, Judith would have been expected to live a quiet, devout life, engaging in religious devotion and effectively disappearing from public affairs. However, Judith was not willing to accept this fate. She had tasted power, held the title of queen twice, and had been educated in the political complexities of European courts. Rather than resigning herself to a life of seclusion, Judith made plans to escape, and in doing so, she would dramatically alter the course of European history. While confined at Senlis, Judith's path crossed with a man known as Baldwin Ironarm, a rising noble from the Flemish region. Baldwin, known for his military prowess and ambition, was a Frankish noble of relatively modest status, although some more romantic tales about him state he was the son of a forester. He actually held lands in Flanders as a minor count, a region that was still developing as a political power, but he was not from a ruling dynasty like Judith. Despite his lesser rank, he was a skilled warrior, gaining his epithet Ironarm for his strength and battlefield reputation. It is unclear how Baldwin and Judith first encountered each other. Given her confinement, it is unlikely they met in traditional courtly settings, although it is possible also that they could have briefly met when she was a child at court. Some historians speculate that Baldwin may have visited the monastery either as part of a noble retinue or as a soldier stationed nearby. Others suggest that Judith's allies at court may have helped facilitate their meeting. What is clear is that Baldwin and Judith quickly formed a bond, one that would lead to one of the most dramatic royal elopements of the early Middle Ages. Sometime around December 861, Judith and Baldwin made their move, along with the help of her brother Louis. Rather than remaining at Senlis under her father's control, Judith escaped with Baldwin. The exact details of how this occurred are unclear, but it is likely that Baldwin smuggled her out, possibly with the help of sympathizers. It could have been a kidnapping, but many medieval kidnappings were in fact carried out with the consent of the future bride. This was no ordinary political marriage. It was a defiant act of rebellion. For Judith, marrying Baldwin meant escaping her father's control and avoiding a forced monastic life, as well as marrying a man of her choosing, rather than one selected for political gain. For Baldwin, the stakes were equally high. Marrying Judith elevated his status immensely and gave him royal legitimacy for Flanders, which was still a relatively minor power. It was also a challenge to the Frankish crown, however, which had long overlooked Flemish nobility. Their elopement was a scandal of the highest order. In Frankish law, noblewomen, especially queens or princesses, were not meant to marry without royal approval. By running away and marrying Baldwin, Judith had directly and publicly defied her father's authority. Charles was enraged. He immediately declared Baldwin a traitor, excommunicated him, and called upon his allies to hunt the couple down. According to Archbishop Hincmar of Reims, Charles called a council of bishops and nobles in his kingdom and asked them to pass excommunication on Baldwin. carefully framing the elopement as a kidnapping to prevent his daughter receiving the same fate. After all, she was still a useful political pawn. Judith's brother Louis was punished by imprisonment in the Abbey of Saint-Martin. Meanwhile, the eloped couple first sought refuge with the Viking Rorik of Dorstad, king of Friesland, later fleeing to Judith's cousin, Lothair II, king of Lotharingia, staying for a while at his court. Eventually, with few safe places left to go, Baldwin and Judith travelled to Rome to seek the protection of Pope Nicholas I. This was a bold and unprecedented move. Rather than trying to appease Charles, the couple sought papal approval for their marriage, arguing that their union was legitimate and should be recognised by the Church. Pope Nicholas, known for his assertive stance against royal overreach, intervened on their behalf. Despite Charles's fury, the Pope refused to annul the marriage, affirming its validity. He sent legates to reason with Charles, even using the political angle of Baldwin possibly siding with Rorik if Charles didn't relent, who had already fought against Charles once before. The Pope urged Charles to accept Baldwin as his son-in-law, recognising that reconciliation was the best path forward. Nicholas was wise enough to position himself as an arbitrator in European politics, showing that even powerful kings had to abide by papal authority. Whether or not he really agreed with what Judith and Baldwin had done was secondary to using the opportunity to push the authority of the Church. It worked. By 862, Charles had reluctantly accepted the marriage, officially reinstating Baldwin and Judith at court. However, this did not mean he was actually pleased, rather, he saw it as a necessary compromise to prevent further unrest. He also bestowed the full March of Flanders on Baldwin and made him a Margrave, but this was probably not the kind gesture it looked on the surface. On the one hand, his daughter, who had twice been a queen already, could not merely become a countess, but instead a Margravine. However, there were some who suspected that when Charles gave some of the lands to his new son-in-law, it was because they were already plagued with threats, and it was a possible way to be rid of him. However, Baldwin rose to the challenge, defeated invaders to his new lands, and became a loyal supporter of his father-in-law. With Pope Nicholas's support and her father's reluctant acceptance, Judith transitioned into a new chapter of her life. Her marriage to Baldwin not only marked a triumph of personal agency in an age when royal women were expected to be passive pawns, but it also had far-reaching political consequences. At the time, Flanders was a relatively undeveloped and politically fragmented region, often overshadowed by its more powerful neighbours. But Judith's lineage brought immediate prestige and legitimacy to Baldwin's rule. By marrying a daughter of the Emperor of the Carolingian Empire, although that wouldn't technically come until 875, Baldwin secured not only the admiration of his local subjects, but also recognition from the wider Frankish world. Their union elevated Flanders from a marginal frontier territory to a rising power in northern Europe. At the time of Judith's arrival, Flanders was a buffer region, a liminal territory between the civilized heartlands of West Francia and the chaotic raider-plagued coasts frequented by Vikings. The area had no established central authority, and its loyalty to the Carolingian crown was fragile at best. Judith, with her royal connections and courtly upbringing, brought with her the diplomatic weight of the Carolingian dynasty, which Baldwin shrewdly leveraged to consolidate his authority. She may also have played a role in introducing models of governance, patronage, and ecclesiastical reform to the Flemish court, helping to shape its identity as a culturally rich and politically stable region. The couple's rule was not without challenge, however. Flanders remained vulnerable to external pressures, particularly from Viking incursions and the shifting loyalties of its lords. But Judith's diplomatic acumen and Baldwin's military strength formed a potent partnership. They expanded their territory methodically, incorporating key fortresses and riverside trading towns into their control, including Ghent, Bruges, and later Arras and Courtrai. Judith likely played a significant role in securing internal cohesion among the local nobility, many of whom still identified more closely with the Carolingian centre than with Baldwin's nascent Flemish court. Through carefully brokered marriages, religious patronage, and the adoption of Frankish-style court rituals, she helped imbue the Flemish ruling house with an aura of sanctity and dynastic inevitability. Judith's influence can also be seen in the couple's careful alliance building. Through patronage of monasteries and churches, they secured the support of religious institutions. Judith, following in her mother Ermentrude's devout footsteps, was said to have taken a deep interest in promoting Christian piety, which served both religious and political purposes. By fostering ecclesiastical loyalty, she and Baldwin cemented their authority and created the cultural underpinnings for a stable dynastic rule. Ultimately, Judith's marriage, initially seen as a scandal, became a foundation stone of Flemish identity and power. In asserting her will and defying tradition, Judith did not just shape her own destiny, she helped shape the destiny of a nation. Judith's own royal blood tracing back to Charlemagne would also give her children a powerful dynastic legitimacy. This lineage was no small matter. In the highly status-conscious society of medieval Europe, noble pedigree carried as much weight as land and military strength. Baldwin and Judith's offspring would not only inherit their parents' lands, but also their connections, their prestige, and the claim to Carolingian blood. The couple had at least 3 children, though the exact number is uncertain due to gaps in the historical record, and it could have been as many as 5. The most prominent of their children was Baldwin II of Flanders, who succeeded his father and continued the work of fortifying and expanding Flemish power. Under Baldwin II, Flanders further solidified its identity as an independent political and military force. He would later marry Ealhfrith, a daughter of Alfred the Great of Wessex, thus linking Judith's line back to England, where she herself had once been queen. This Anglo-Flemish connection would re-emerge generations later, particularly during the Norman and Plantagenet periods. It is not difficult to imagine that Judith, with her unique experience as both a twice-anointed queen in England and a Frankish princess, would have taken a strong hand in guiding the upbringing and education of her children. She had lived in some of the most prestigious courts of her age, and her awareness of dynastic politics, courtly decorum, and diplomatic navigation would have been unmatched among noblewomen in Flanders. Her role was not simply reproductive, therefore. She was a political mentor and cultural architect. Though medieval chroniclers often downplayed the political agency of women, Judith's influence is evident in the historical consequences of her marriage and motherhood. She had defied the might of the Frankish court, won papal support, and then turned her rebellion into one of the most successful dynastic ventures of the 9th century. Though little is known about the final years of Judith's life, it's likely she spent her later days in Flanders, far from the imperial splendour of her youth. Unlike the dramatic turns of her early years marked by royal courts, coronations, and defiance, her death seems to have passed without grand fanfare, yet it was hardly insignificant. By the time she died, Judith had secured everything that mattered to most rulers of the medieval world: land, lineage, and legacy. She died around the year 879, although the precise date remains uncertain, typical of so many medieval women whose lives, while pivotal, were under-recorded in contemporary chronicles. With her husband Baldwin, she had helped consolidate the counties of Flanders and Artois into a cohesive and defensible realm, resisting both Viking invasions and Carolingian attempts to reassert direct control. She had given birth to a legitimate male heir, Baldwin II, ensuring dynastic continuity. In this regard, Judith achieved what so many royal women of the age were expected to do, but few did so on their own terms as she had. Perhaps Judith's greatest and most enduring legacy was her role in founding the House of Flanders, a dynasty that would grow to rival even the Capetians and Plantagenets in power and influence. And her descendants included Matilda of Flanders, wife of William the Conqueror, Queen of England, and mother of several kings. Through her, Judith became an ancestor of the Norman, Angevin, and Plantagenet kings of England, weaving her bloodline into the very fabric of English royal history. Judith's legacy can be summarized in one simple truth: she refused to disappear. In a world that often erased or sidelined women, she claimed her crown, her marriage, and her dynasty. Whether as Queen of Wessex, Margravine of Flanders, or founding mother of one of Europe's greatest houses, Judith of Flanders remains a figure of quiet revolution, a woman whose life changed the course of history not with armies or edicts, but with courage, cunning, and conviction. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.